Thanks for being along with us. This is Agriculture Today. And some thoughts attuned to management of the cattle herd as we move on through the latter stages of summer now. Even though the warmer days may be waning away, fly pressure in your herds may just be re-amping up. We'll talk about why that might be, focusing on horn flies in particular. Joining us is K-State Research and Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff to pass along some good tips on hornfly management. But back to the life cycle of this pest and why it makes another run at our cattle, so to say. AJ.
Well, it really has to do with the life cycle of the hornfly. So we better understand what we're trying to deal with. Hornflies are a blood-sucking fly that actually spends the majority of their life on cattle. Okay? They only leave cattle to actually drop eggs into the fresh cow pies. So when they spend their entire life on their back, we see a big peak in the spring when those larvae are coming out from the manure and actually going out for their first bit of blood. Afterwards, they thrive in cooler, moist environments. During the hot summer months, do we still have hornflies? Absolutely, but it's not the big peak that we have in the spring. What happens during late summer, and we're talking coming up here pretty quick, late August, early September, when the temperatures start to go down, the humidity levels rise a little bit, we have less of the really hot, really dry days. It's prime time during that late August, early September for another peak in the hornfly population.
And with that flush of flies coming on in the early fall, now is the time you're recommending that the producers start planning for their full control.
Absolutely. So it's all about having a plan. And it's a season-long plan. Mm-hmm. Okay, what has already been done so far earlier in the year? Have you used a fly tag? Have you used different type of spray applications? When were they done? When are you anticipating them to wear off? Because if you put a long-acting ear tag into some of these cattle in early May, it will be finishing its productive life. That ear tag with the insecticide in it will be finishing its productive life by the time early September hits, and all of a sudden we have the next peak of these fly populations. So we need to have a plan in place.
Let's get into that plan and factor in here what might be out there, might not, but the potential for hornfly resistance to certain treatments. And need to clarify whether it's resistance or it's just fading effectiveness of the product.
That's a really good thing to bring up. So resistance, to start off with, hornfly resistance to a lot of our parasiticides, it's a real issue. Okay? So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Resistant hornflies is an issue. But we can manage that and we can help control that. So a lot of the issues on a year-to-year basis comes up with, oh, well, my fly tag, it stopped working. It's resistance. Well, maybe, maybe not. Okay? The fly tag may have just worn off. But one thing I will bring up, especially with the long-term usage, with having residual activity for a long period of time, remember I told you that the hornflies actually spend their entire lives on cattle? Well, if they're in constant contact with a parasiticide, like from an ear tag, resistant issues, they can come up, okay, and it will happen. So what do we do to combat that? Well, as those fly tags, the parasiticide in the ear tag starts to wane, it actually goes to a subtherapeutic dose of some type of chemical, whatever is in that ear tag. When that happens, well, the flies are still exposed to that chemical, but it's not killing them. Okay, so it's not doing anything. That's when resistance can happen. So what we do is during the later summer, later into that season, we actually have to run those animals through and actually remove those ear tags. Okay, and this is a prime time that we can use another treatment. Usually our sprays are our spot-on treatments because they have low residual activity. Mm-hmm. And the products that we use that have low residual activity, there's a much less likelihood of developing resistance. Now, these late-season treatments, the big thing to think about is the fly population out of that pasture has been exposed to one chemical if they've been using an ear tag all season. So what do we do at the end of the season? That we should assume that some resistance is built up in that population.
You don't go back in with the same tag.
Correct. And what we do is we can switch it up, okay? So we used one type of fly tag season long. Here we're getting later in the season. We pull that tag that's already spent. We can pull that out of the ear, and then we can use a spot-on or a spray type treatment, but we need to switch the chemical class.
Not just the brand name per se.
Not the name brand. So, yes, it's a different name brand, but we're actually switching chemical classes. Okay, so when we switch the chemical class, it does a couple of different things. One, it reduces overall population of horn flies. Number two, any flies that did develop resistance to the one chemical that was in the ear tag, we can actually decrease that overall population so they don't overwinter. We're protecting our chemicals to continue working into the next year.
And that's something we don't think about often, that we are managing for the long pull when we go about rotating products here.
Right. So we're really trying to protect each product to make sure that they are useful and continue to remain, effective for years to come. So we really need to think about it on a year-to-year basis, that it's a full system of rotating those products to make sure that they work up to what they should be doing every time. So just because something worked really good this year does not mean you continue to use that year after year until it stops working, okay? We want to try to avoid that at all costs.
So what it requires of a producer is they become familiar with what they're using, and that is by the chemistry that makes up those products. And there are three main kinds.
There are three main types of products. The first is pyrethroids. We have synthetic pyrethroids. When you read the label, you'll see pyrethroid. The second is organophosphates. Been around for a long time, still very efficacious. The other type of product is our macrocytic lactones. Okay, and we really have multitude of different products from each of these three classes. We have sprays, we have pour-ons, and we have ear tags from each of these three classes. So be cognizant of what you're using and when you've used it so you're properly rotating. If you have questions on this, by all means, reach out to your local veterinarian and work with them to help create some type of protocol that you know what you're going to use during different times of the year. The other question that often comes up is, what about our IGR type products? We do have some feed-through that's often included in mineral called IGR, or insect growth regulators. These IGR products do not interfere with some of our other products that we use for parasiticides. So something to keep in mind, regardless of the use of what you're doing with either an ear tag, your spot-on, your sprays, your walk-through rubs, your IGR that you feed in the mineral does not interfere with any of that activity.
Those could actually complement your other treatments then? Is that what you're saying?
They can. Because the IGR actually interferes with the life cycle, that they won't complete a full life cycle in the manure patty. And that helps decrease the overall population. It won't eliminate it because flies can still come in from other operations. Fence lines don't block flies. So unfortunately, but it will decrease the overall population.
Yeah. But again, getting back to the key here, that is, you want to rotate chemistry and not just think in terms of switching from an ear tag to, say, a pour-on, because if those are of the same chemical class, you're not gaining any traction here.
That's correct. So late season, we switch the type of product. So we go from an ear tag to, say, a pour-on. And when we do that, we need to switch that chemical class so we can really make sure that we're decreasing the overall population and we're not exposing these flies to even more of the same chemical for the entire season.
Again, AJ, this requires of producers that they handle the animals one more time in all likelihood. But that's labor well spent.
It is. I mean, when we talk about horn flies and the effect of production, the overall loss of weight gain, I mean, the list goes on and on, that yes, it is an increase in labor. It is an extra time that we need to maybe move these animals into a holding corral. So yes, that does take time. It does take energy. It does take money. But the cost return can really be great. Different things to think about. Okay, sometimes you need to think outside of the box. Okay, this late season treatment may not mean you have to run every animal through a head catch and catch each individual animal. Some operations have their cattle that are pretty well taught. Producers can actually walk out or ride their four-wheeler close by these animals, where a spray product can actually be utilized in either a hand pump sprayer or even an electric pump sprayer on the back of an ATV, or even running them through a catch corral and just through an open alley where you can properly treat each individual animal as they move through. So things to think about, see what can work on your operation. Every operation is a little bit different with both time, cattle, you name it. So make some of these management practices fit your operation.
Because, in closing, that next run of horn flies is coming right around the corner, it says.
It's right on our heels, and it's going to be here before we know it. So have a game plan, talk with your veterinarian, and try to implement these practices as best of your ability.
Timing for this message, very appropriate, and we appreciate you coming over and sharing these thoughts, A.J.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming by. He's A.J. Tarpoff, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension. Again, horn flies about to assert themselves once again for the fall season. Cattle producers, be on top of that situation by having your fly control program aligned and adjusted to respond to that fly pressure. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll return in a moment on the K-State Radio Network. Stay with us.
Today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Sarah Moyer here with a crop entomologist from K-State, Jeff Whitworth. He is going to be talking with us about insects that are feeding on soybean plants right now, and he's out in the field currently calling in, so it's great to have you on, Jeff.
Yes, my pleasure, Sarah. Glad to be here.
There are a number of insects that are out in fields of soybeans in Kansas, and what are the ones that producers should be concerned about?
There really are, and there's going to be more as the season goes along, which there always seems to be. You know, like I keep telling them, I'm always amazed that 30 years ago, our main problems in Kansas as far as agricultural pests were in corn and sorghum. We didn't even have any in soybeans for the most part. And in the last 15 to 20 years, pretty much can manage the pest problems in corn. And I say that, but pretty much we can. But we're seeing more and more problems in soybeans, it seems like, every year. This year is no exception. Now, last year we had real problems with green clover worms starting in the southeast corner of the state, and they moved all the way across the state, defoliating as they went. There was a lot of aerial application and ground application went on for green clover worms. This year we've not seen green clover worms as much. I mean, there's always a few you can find in alfalfa or soybeans, but this year, so far, what we're seeing in both the regularly planted beans and the double crop soybeans, at least for the last 2 weeks, have been thistle caterpillars. It's not a new pest for Kansas, but in the 30 years plus that I've been doing this, this is probably the heaviest infestation I've seen, at least in the north central part of the state, and with thistle caterpillars. A thistle caterpillar is kind of a thorny-looking little caterpillar, and they get in sunflowers and soybeans. They get in a lot of weeds also, but as far as crops, the ones we are concerned with are sunflowers and soybeans. The first generation is just coming out, and it has in the last 4 or 5 days. That's what I've been getting a lot of calls about, these black, white, orange butterflies that are flying around. Some of the guys describe it in the millions in their field, and some of the fields I've seen, there are a lot of them. Those are the result of the thistle caterpillars that have been feeding in the soybeans. Now, one of the questions I'm getting is there going to be another generation? Yes, there will be another generation. The thing about the thistle caterpillar, they're defoliators. They get in the leaves and they cover themselves up, web the leaves together, so they're in a nice little self-contained pocket where it's pretty difficult to spray them if they reach a treatment threshold, kind of like webworms. I've been getting calls about webworms and thistle caterpillars, which if you do decide to treat, if you do decide your field justifies insecticide application, you need to make sure you get enough carrier or water pressure to break through the canopy and break through the webbing to get to where the insects are, because these are contact insecticides, so they have to contact the insect itself or contact the surface, so you get some residual action that the insect will contact eventually. They're migratory. They're here every year, but I've never seen them in these numbers. Generally, it's just in a spot in the field. It's not throughout the whole field. It's just a localized place where there'll be a whole bunch of caterpillars feeding on a few plants. So that's one thing. But we also have bean leaf beetles. The bean leaf beetles are probably our number one soybean pest throughout the soybean growing regions of the United States annually. The adults are just now coming on, so they're going to start adding to the defoliation. The thing that I worry more about with the adult bean leaf beetle is once the beans start to set pods, the adult beetles will start feeding on the pods themselves. So that's the marketable product. So they can do damage relatively quickly once they start feeding on the pods. If they're feeding on the leaves, the soybean plants are pretty resilient at accepting quite a bit of defoliation, depending upon what stage they're in, 30, 40, up to maybe 50 or 60%, depending upon vegetative or reproductive stages. But once those adult beetles start feeding on the pods, then it becomes pretty critical. So if your beans are starting to set pods and you have a bean leaf beetle, feeding on every pod, about every row foot, you might need to consider an insecticide application. The thing about the bean leaf beetles is this is going to be the last generation. These adults that are coming out now are going to overwinter. So if you take care of them, protect your plants now, you probably won't have any more to worry about. But the other defoliators that we're getting lots of calls about are spider mites. Every year they're in corn and soybeans, and every year is different relative to how many we have, the densities of them. In soybeans, this year I've started getting calls earlier than usual, which seems a little strange, but it has been hot and dry in different parts of the state, and that helps spider mites. Plus, some of the growers, when they sprayed their weeds in their soybean fields, they put in a little insecticide just in case, which we always recommend not to do unless you need it, and that killed a lot of the beneficials, which has helped flare some of the spider mites in some cases. So if you are having spider mites and you're getting upwards of 40 to 50% of the mites that are killing the leaves on your soybean plants, and it's in the early reproductive stages, again, you may consider using a miticide. The last insect that I haven't gotten calls about, but I will because they're coming out of corn, and that's the corn earworm. There's been a lot of corn earworms in field corn this year, and as those mature and crawl out of the ear and they'll pupate in the ground, then the adult moth will fly around and mate, and then they will head for soybeans and or sorghum because the corn will be too mature, too far along for the larvae to feed on. So they'll start laying eggs in the soybeans and or the heads of sorghum. And again, they'll feed right on the marketable product. So they'll feed on the seed within the pod, unlike the adult bean leaf beetle, which feeds on the pod. The corn earworm larva feeds on the seed within the pod. Or if it's in sorghum, they will feed right on the head of the sorghum plant where they're feeding on the kernels. So again, they're feeding on the marketable product, so they can do damage quite quickly. So the growers need to get out and sample and just be aware of what's going on. Make sure you got a good sampling program. Get out weekly and sample. And the nice thing about it is a lot of our insecticides or miticides do work pretty well, but you do have to make sure you get enough carrier because you got to remember that soybean canopy is pretty dense and it protects those insects that are within that canopy.
And Jeff, before we wrap up, what are some of the ideal treatment windows for, let's break it out, the second generation of those thistle caterpillars that are going to be coming in and the bean leaf beetle before they overwinter? You want to catch those, as you mentioned, and those corn earworms as they start to become a problem. What do you foresee as some recommendations?
Good question. First of all, defoliation, which is what the thistle caterpillars will do. Like I said, soybeans can withstand quite a bit of defoliation before it starts to impact yield. So unless you've gotten, like 7 or 8 per row foot of thistle caterpillars, or they're defoliating, which is easier to actually determine if they're defoliating up to 50 to 60% of your soybeans, or any of them, combination of the bean-leaf beetles feeding on the leaves, or any of these insects, combination feeding causes 40 to 50% defoliation in the early reproductive stages. You probably should consider an insecticide application. With the larvae of the earworm feeding on the pods and or bean-leaf beetles, generally if you got 1 per row foot, you probably should consider treating. Also, I should mention the stink bugs. Stink bugs are out and about, and there are quite a few stink bugs. We found quite a few green stink bugs. They will feed right on the developing seed within the pod also. They're a little bit harder to detect when you're out sampling. You got to bend over a row foot of the foliage and vigorously shake it like you do for bean-leaf beetles or corn earworm larvae. And they're a little harder to shake loose of the foliage. But again, if you have any of these pod feeding or seed feeding insects that are feeding directly on the marketable product, about 1 per row foot will justify a treatment.
Some good recommendations for farmers to be considering with their soybean plants. Jeff, a final reminder for farmers is to be taking care of volunteer wheat, correct?
Yes. Every year, time we get rain or a little moisture, we get a new flush of volunteer wheat. And with the problems we had with wheat curl mites and wheat streak mosaic and the Hessian fly last year or this past spring, we're trying to remind everybody, make sure you control your volunteer wheat in a timely fashion. If nothing else, at the last resort, at least get rid of all the volunteer wheat 2 weeks before you plant your wheat this fall.
And once again, thank you, Jeff, for coming on and speaking with us.
Yes, my pleasure, Sarah. Thank you very much.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth talking about the insects that are feeding on soybean plants right now and some treatment options and recommendations as those pests do become an issue. I'm Sarah Moyer, and we'll have more here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines. In brief, these courtesy in part of DTN. House Agriculture Committee Chairman Michael Conaway said yesterday that his committee will begin work on the next farm bill within the next 8 weeks, noting that he wants to get it on the House floor yet this year. Conaway wants to bring the bill to the floor of the House in the fourth quarter of 2017, he says, because he dislikes the turmoil of extensions, as he put it. The 2014 Farm Bill expires September the 30th of 2018. Conaway also noted that Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman Pat Roberts said last week that he also would like to write the Farm Bill in 2017, and that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had said the sooner the better. Besides Conaway and Peterson, that being Colin Peterson, the House Agriculture Committee chairman from Minnesota, committee members who attended the event included Roger Marshall of Kansas, among others. A series of cotton growers and other farm leaders urged the committee as they met to include cotton in the commodity title of the program. Cotton was taken out in 2014 to satisfy a World Trade Organization case the U.S. had lost to Brazil because the panel decided that the U.S. cotton program had caused damage to Brazilian farmers because it interfered with world markets. The farm leaders also called for the continuation of crop insurance and commodity conservation and foreign market development and promotion programs in the next farm bill. The linkage between conservation compliance and crop insurance premium subsidies continues to draw complaints. However, a new study by the USDA's Economic Research Service shows the link helps reduce the farming risks on highly erodible lands and wetland conversions. This study found that if Congress were to take away the link to the crop insurance subsidy, conservation compliance on highly erodible land would fall from 25 million acres to closer to 14 million acres. Compliance for crop insurance continues to have its critics, including Senator Roberts. At a recent hearing, he said, and he asked insurance professionals about problems with conservation compliance linkage to crop insurance. Roberts said that he felt in 2014 that the link to insurance was, in his words, unneeded, costly, and burdensome. The chairman of the Crop Insurance Professionals Association, William Cole, told senators that the intention of the 2014 language was to bring more farmers into compliance, but the paperwork became a hassle for some. If this stays in, and quoting Cole, we have a lot to simplify it without the penalties when they lose coverage. Farmers are at risk of losing their crop insurance premium subsidies and access to other commodity and conservation funds, as well as USDA farm loans, if they're found to be out of compliance with basic conservation measures on highly erodible lands and wetlands. The incentives to remain in compliance with conservation provisions shifted in the 14 Farm Bill, not just because of the compliance link, but also because of ending direct payments, according to the ERS report. The commodity title of the Farm Bill was reduced, and that shifted the major safety net protection to crop insurance and the premium subsidy that farmers receive. At the time, it was also noted that about 36% of farmers received commodity or conservation payments, but as much as 93% of cropland was on farms that either received commodity payments or crop insurance premium subsidies. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue has taken off now on a 5-state RV tour. The USDA announced that the Secretary's Back to Our Roots tour will focus on getting input on the 2018 Farm Bill, as well as working to increase rural prosperity. He will be touring Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. In a statement, Secretary Perdue said the tour will allow the USDA to hear from people in agriculture as well as consumers, noting and quoting, "They are the ones on the front lines of American agriculture, and they know best what the current issues are." Perdue added that the USDA will be intimately involved as Congress deliberates and formulates the 2018 Farm Bill. Quoting him again, "We are committed to making the resources and the research available so that Congress can make the good facts-based, data-driven decisions." He went on to say it's important to look at past practices to see what has worked and what has not worked so that we can create a farm bill for the future that will be embraced by American agriculture in 2018. Well, Kansas ranchers affected by wildfire earlier this year continue to rebuild their businesses. Todd Domer reports here some financial help has arrived for many of those ranchers.
The Kansas Livestock Foundation has distributed $2.75 million in wildfire relief funds to 165 Kansas applicants. A special committee, including representatives from the Kansas Livestock Association and the foundation, reviewed the applications and determined how the funds were allocated. Applicants for the funds lost about 4,500 head of total livestock and nearly 2,000 miles of fence to wildfires back in March. Livestock and fence losses reported by applicants totaled more than $20 million. The applicants had more than 365,000 acres of grass burned. Kansas Livestock Foundation leaders extend a special thanks to those who donated to the Wildfire Relief Fund. Nearly 3,900 generous contributors from 48 states, the District of Columbia, the Virgin Islands, and Canada gave to the cause. In Kansas, donations were received from 102 counties. Ranchers will put the relief funds to good use as volunteer and paid fencing crews continue to replace damaged and destroyed fence. Although the grass is good enough to turn cattle out after good spring and early summer rains, Ranchers in the burned area report external fences must first be in place. Not many ranchers have begun replacing cattle due to the lack of fenced grazing resources. I'm Todd Domer.
And Kansas State University, in partnership with the Kansas Water Office, are providing an opportunity to see firsthand what's taking place on water technology demonstration farms, hosting a series of field days in this month of August, including 2 next week. Each location will showcase the technology that's been implemented on that site and the results to date. Here are the scheduled field days: Monday, August the 7th at Circle C Farms near Healy, Friday, August the 11th at Hatcher Land and Cattle Company near Liberal, Monday, August the 14th at Waterpack ILS near Larned, at Tuesday the 15th at T&O Farms near Garden City, Thursday the 24th of August at Northwest Technical College at Goodland, and later on Big D Farms near Holcomb will host another of these field days. There are opportunities to learn more about practices, irrigation companies, soil water sensors, and others will be on demonstration. For more information, go to kwo.ks.gov. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
Years ago, I met and talked with an older Kansan who told me how he had participated flying the bombers over that part of the Netherlands.
That's Gus van der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
When our children were small, we often used a Dutch prayer at the dinner table. It goes like this: Heere, zegen deze spijzen. Amen. It's a short prayer, but it asks for God to bless the food on the table. Heere, zegen deze spijzen. Amen. To be honest, I'm not that much of a praying man, but I do think, and in my way, do communicate. And I do not take food on the table for granted, especially not my wife, who knew hunger during the war. She remembers living through the hunger winter of 1944, World War II, as a child. She has told the children that one time at dinner time the bell rang, and there stood a little boy who said he was hungry. People asked for food all the time, but here was this unknown child. Anneke's mother invited the child in and set an extra plate out on the table besides the 7 which were there, and she said, "Where 7 eat, 8 can eat as well." They shared and ate whatever food they had that evening. After the meal, and all had emptied their plates, their little guest grabbed his plate and licked it clean. The younger brothers looked on with awe and wonder as Mom did not say anything. Afterwards, when the boy had gone on his way, Anneke's brother asked their mother, "Mom, did you see that? He licked his plate." And Mother said, "Yes, I saw it. And that is how hungry he was." They never saw the boy again. It was war. Years ago, I met and talked with an older Kansan who told me how he had participated flying the bombers over that part of the Netherlands, literally Holland, west provinces where he had dropped food. He recalled flying so low and looking into the German air defenses and seeing the Dutch people standing on the streets and rooftops, waving as they thundered over, dropping food at the designated dropping zones. Heere, zegen deze spijzen. Amen. Anneke has shared with the children how that was. Where I grew up, we did not know hunger. Shortages, yes, but no hunger. Anyway, Martin, the youngest son, also grew up with Heere, zegen deze spijzen, amen. He remembered, and as he visited on a home trip a few years ago, he said at dinner table, "Whatever happened to the prayer, Heer zegen amen?" I said, "What?" Yes, he said, "What happened to the prayer, Heer zegen amen?" I laughed. He was a child who had never understood the Dutch prayer we shared at the table. So now grown, I repeated and slowly said it, and he understood. Heere, zegen deze spijzen. Amen. That is the same child who as a youngster when put to bed asked his mother, who had prayed in Dutch, "Vader, houd ook deze nacht over Martientje trouw de wacht." God keep an eye over Martin this night as he sleeps. Martin, all tucked under, looks at his mom and asks, "How does God do that? Does she come into my room and sit with me?" Anneke explained. Martin looks at her and says, "I'd much rather have Daddy come and sit with me." It does make you wonder, being a parent. As I said earlier, I'm not that much of a praying man, but I do think, and as Anneke goes to church, I make the coffee for when she comes back. But I think and hold my prayers. So when I saw this prayer, it really spoke to me as it should have spoken to the power that is. It was sent to me by a friend, and I could just see it all. Here is a great prayer. A visiting pastor was attending a men's breakfast in farm country. He asked one of the impressive older farmers, a huge man in attendance, to say grace that morning. And after all were seated, the older farmer began. He stood up. "Lord, I hate buttermilk." The pastor opened one eye and wondered to himself where this was going. Then the farmer loudly proclaimed, "Lord, I hate lard." Now the pastor was worried. However, without missing a beat, the farmer prayed on. "And Lord, you know I don't care much for raw, white flour." Just as the pastor was ready to stand up and stop everything, the farmer continued, "But Lord, when you mix them all together and bake them up, I do love fresh biscuits. So Lord, when things come up we don't like, when life gets hard, when you just don't understand what you are saying to us, we just need to relax and wait till you're done mixing, and probably it will be something even better than biscuits. Amen.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University. Stop, Look, and Listen is presented each Wednesday here on the broadcast. And with that, today's edition comes to a close. As always, thanks to you for being along with us. We'll be back here tomorrow, this same time. Hope you will as well. Until then, and for Sarah Moyer, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.